Hi, I'm Jack Berkowitz. I'm the Chief Data Officer of Securiti. We're a company that specializes in data security, data privacy, and now generative AI, governance, security, privacy, and all the other important things going on in the data community. Thanks for being with us today. I'm here in rainy Atlanta today. It's been a little blustery as we enter the fall, and with me today is Junaid Farooq, formerly the Chief Data Officer at First Citizens, but now pursuing some passion projects. And Junaid, welcome to the interview.
Great to be here, Jack. Thanks for having me.
Great. You've got an interesting sort of a trajectory, right? You've spent a lot of time working on various problems in the data space, particularly in financial services. Tell me something particular that you're proud of in your career.
It's I have had the opportunity to so many interesting things in my 20 some odd years of working. It's hard to pick just one, but maybe I'll talk about the last sort of initiative or work that I was doing, and that was being at the helm of a data management and data governance program that saw two of the largest bank mergers, or for First Citizens, the two largest bank mergers that they've had. And it was propelling this bank from a several years ago $35 billion bank to today over a $200 billion bank. You can imagine the complexities around two large mergers like that. Interestingly enough, that bank has acquired something like 25 banks since 2008. So imagine what the infrastructure and the institution looks like from a data perspective. And so rebooting that program in the short term gave us investor, regulator, executive, and board confidence, and in the long term, put together a program that would lead us to innovation. So
And,
pretty,
and so, that's great, right? A lot of chief data officers, and we're going to get to some questions about, Gen AI and everything. And we all get fascinated by building our lake houses and everything else. But at the end of the day, a lot of what you're doing is just making sure that the information is flowing, right?
That's yeah, when you have talk about data silos, when you talk about over 20 different acquisitions and these two large ones, um, getting at the data is extraordinarily difficult. One of the things that I would say in situations like this, you use technology to solve data silos, but one thing that I would say I have leaned on heavily is to solve the data silo problem. I work to solve the people silo problem. And if you can build bridges across the organization, across people, you could really mitigate the data silos, because there is so much institutional knowledge that sit with people and extracting it out of them. But yeah, to your point, a big part, like every CDO, ultimately in very simple terms, our work is finding the data, uh, having data around the data, ensuring that it's fit for purpose in the most simplest terms. But what that means, really, in more complex terms, is taking data to drive revenue generation, drive operating efficiencies and cost efficiencies, meeting regulatory requirements, mitigating risk, and to do that, you've got to have a really well thought out, robust data strategy that pins or like is linked to a business strategy. Um, and yeah, so it's all about the data.
Yeah, definitely. And you touched on two things. In my current role, I'm spending a lot of time really just working with CDOs and their teams. Lots of different clients and people. And everybody's always asking me, well, how do I operate these systems at scale? What's that model, right? Do we centralize? Do we distribute? Do we go to hybrid? And then, to your point, hey, and I always start the conversation with, What's your definition of good here?
Yeah.
What do you consider to be a good outcome? Is it profit? Is it reduction of risk? Is it clarity to regulators? Defining that up front then allows you to do and make progress. So let's transition a little bit. Let's talk about then the application of all this new technology that's the rage. It's the fall. We're about to get into conference season, right? In fact, I just saw my old company Oracle's just have their conference right now. So we're going to hear a lot about generative AI, a lot about generative AI in the financial institutions and into banks and everything. What are you thinking about, right, when you are working and thinking about how do I bring generative AI into, whether it's that merger of those banks or a single institution? What are you thinking about in terms of unstructured data?
It's funny when you were asking that question, for some reason, the Gartner hype cycle popped in my mind. And if you're not familiar, for viewers who are not familiar, there's this wave, right? You have this innovation trigger and people racing to the top of doing work in what they perceive to be sort of the next big thing. And I think the top is called the peak of inflated expectations. And then there's this steep drop off, all the way down, below from where we started, called the trough of disillusionment. And then there's a slight curve back up called the slope of enlightenment, and it plateaus into a plateau of productivity. And I think that hype cycle, it's just very accentuated in terms of the curves and the slopes. I think it's going to be different for AI. I think that a few years ago everybody was blockchain, and you saw that curve, like steep rise, steep fall. And I don't know that I've ever seen that slope of enlightenment and like any notable sort of productivity scale personally. But I think for AI, it's going to be different. I think that AI is here to stay, and I'll give you some very practical examples on how I think about it from a data governance perspective, or at least through one pillar. Gen AI is very useful to create synthetic test data. You could create synthetic test data for derivatives. You can create market scenarios, and you don't have to wait for data to be created. So you can have test data that's created for you. You can also use Gen AI to start writing data quality rules. So there are today a lot of productive uses of it. And I think that it will scale very easily. And one of the things, you mentioned scale earlier in terms of how do you scale things. One of the things that I would say is I have always believed in the democratization of data. I've always believed in data literacy, data democratization. I've always lived by this saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think now we should be pivoting from like the democratization of data to the democratization of AI. And we have to, I think, for an organization to be successful, I always used to say you have to be data literate at every level. The CEO has to have some level of data literacy, and your accountants, your lawyers, your marketers, right, have to have some amount of data literacy. And now, the way I think about it is that everyone's got to have some level of AI literacy to use this technology to augment their work. And when it comes to unstructured data that you mentioned, I very coincidentally a few weeks ago ran into a marine biologist, and he told me this very interesting statistic. He said only 20% of the deep sea is actually charted. And when you think about unstructured data, I just saw this parallel. I thought that something like, I think 80%, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Jack, 80% of our data is unstructured, right? I don't know the precise number, but the vast majority, 80 to 90% is what I've heard. And he said something really profound to me. He said, we know more about deep space than we do about the deep sea. He said, we can look 13.8 billion light years in terms of time, and yet we don't know what is at 80%, in terms of the resources that we may have right sort of underneath our nose. And one of the things that I think about when it comes to unstructured data and why this sort of persists is that we've never had the technology before. Like the technology still doesn't exist to go to deep sea, to deal with the pressures of the deep sea and the environment of the deep sea. And we are finally turning a corner, I think, in recent years, where the technology now is emerging for us to go discover unstructured data, catalog that unstructured data, summarize that vast amount of unstructured data into meaningful insight. And I think it's the most interesting time, I think, where we have always known that it's existed. I don't know that we've always understood the value that it has. Like we don't know today. I bet if gold mining companies and diamond mining companies and oil companies could had the technology, they would be in the deep sea looking right if they had the
Yeah.
technology.
Yeah.
I feel that way about unstructured data. I was like, we just have, I think, a lot of value that institutions have not been able to tap.
Okay. So awesome way for us to just wrap this up. Um, I work at Security AI. I'm the chief data officer there. My role is to really work with chief data officers, adopting our technology and working to really enable that advantage that you just talked about, right? How do you label that information? How do you classify that information? How do you catalog it? How do you bring it together so that the right people are seeing the right information as well? Because there's a security concern, or at least a governance concern on some of this information. So, and I'm hearing it, right? Everybody's feeling now, hey, we're starting to see those success stories, right? And people are starting to say, hey, wait a second, we were able to do some pretty significant things. And so thank you, Junaid, for taking the time to meet with us today. Super excited to see, your passion projects move forward. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, Jack.